Hi, I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. This is Part 3. It's the beginning of Part 3, Group Strategy. And we finished Part 2 in the last video. This section is quite long, so it consists of 8 pieces. The introduction, which is short, a piece on geography and resources, one on competitors, the military, how the internal relations are organized, and a little bit on economics, how elites and institutions form, the systems of persistence or the institutions of cultural production, the group differences in demographic distribution, group life cycles, and the summary. This section's on the introduction. So what problem are we trying to solve here? I mean, we're talking about group strategies. This is sort of rolls up most of what we've been working on over the first principles. It comes to what does a civilization result in? So what's the origin of our civilizational differences? You know, are these differences substantive? And is there serious or significant consequences to them? Or are they arbitrary, or as many would like to say, cultural differences are relative and meaningless? If we have differences, how malleable are they? Is it easy to change or difficult to change our strategy? Is there a conflict between civilizations, as Huntington proposed, and as it seems like we're facing today? And if so, why? What can we understand about our own civilizational strategy? I mean, what is different about European civilization? What can we learn about mankind as a whole from understanding group differences and group strategies? Can we explain the course of history differently given the differences in these group strategies? If there are differences. And can we reform, restore, or improve the course of history if we choose to? Well, all people rely on some group evolutionary strategy for their survival, competition, and evolution. There's 500 dead gods, so that means there's 500 dead civilizations? Well, no, because the term we use for civilization applies to something very large scale. I tend to refer to as now today there are just a few civilizations extant. These roughly represent our races. But when I'm talking about history, I generally will use the technique of referring to a civilization as a group with a strategy, an identity and a strategy. So where today we have Hindu civilization, at one point that was a much smaller part of that territory. So what do I want to say? So today we're going to discuss the macro civilizations that are extant: Africa, South Eurasia, which we think of as Islam and India, Europe, which we think of as Christendom, Chinese civilization, and I will often interject with Korean Japanese, which I think is the closest to the Western. And did I mention African in there? Yes, I mentioned African.
I mentioned Russia.
I put Russia in Christendom. It's because Europe is for genetic. No, I want to answer the question for everybody. Because Russia is Orthodox, right? We have Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, and we have Russian, Eastern European, or Slavic. We have Baltic civilization. We have Old Europe, and we have Southern Europe, the Latin civilizations, as you know. And so we have this group of civilizations that form a spectrum from the Atlantic to the Urals, and now that Russia has taken over the Siberian continent all the way to the Pacific. I mean, we got to remember that Russia used to own Alaska. So what is it that demarcates our civilizations? Well, it's The causal properties behind it are geography. Geography certainly has an impact on our strategy. What economic resources we have certainly does. Obviously, if you're in the desert, in the tundra, in the steppe, in grasslands, which is more, yeah, let's say grasslands, because there's a difference between the grasslands in Eurasia and the grasslands, say, in Africa. There in the forests or the river valleys, or your coastal. These are all different resources because you have, frankly, different access to water, and water tends to be the function that concentrates resources for us. What military capability and technology do you have? What competitors do you have? How heterogeneous is your population? Are you like China, which has expanded slowly and covered a lot of territory, accumulating nine other peoples, I think, something like that. And so the Han Chinese have expanded, sort of like Europeans expanded around the world. The Han expanded across across what's today's China. You have India, which is a relatively homogeneous people with a cline to it, like Europe. And you have very complex civilizations both in the Middle East and in Africa. So sorry, my chest is today. So your competitors have a pretty big influence on how you view the world. Your genetics matter. I mean, is your underclass vast? Is your underclass very small? What is the relationship between your upper class, your middle class, and your lower class? And once you have this group strategy that's coalesced based on those factors, what institutions do you use, have you evolved to persist that strategy? Dr. Brad is auditing me to make sure I say people didn't choose their strategies necessarily. These strategies tend to be deterministic based on these criteria. And once they're deterministic, though, we reinforce them by slightly different means. So that group strategy is reinforced by a metaphysics, in other words, a set of value judgments or perceptions of yours and your people's relationship to the universe, the world, the universe, and others. You develop a mythology to explain, justify, and lionize it. So you want that strategy to be called heroic. So if you're China and you're looking for one kind of harmony, you're India, a different kind of harmony, Europe is a different kind of harmony, the Middle East has a different kind of harmony, and Africa doesn't seem to be able to be lucky enough to be able to have produced one yet, although it seems to be in the process. You need a wisdom literature. I mean, why we know what wisdom literatures are, is that they start out with a mythology and then it's defended by some set of literature afterwards. This might be philosophy in the West and rational philosophy in the West. It could be reasonable philosophy in China. It could be in the rest of the East. It could be mythical philosophy, in other words, the borderline between religion and myth that we see in the Hindu world. It could be strictly constructed religion in the Middle East, or it could be based on familism and pragmatism and Magianism that's still common in Africa. Or was until very recently. And then once you've got that wisdom literature, that in other words, you have this metaphysical. This is a hierarchy of increasing precision, right? So you have a metaphysics that you probably don't know what it means. It's just assumptions about the world. A mythology that explains it and help us teach it. A wisdom literature, basically for mature adults. A system of argument to persuade and defend it by reasoning. This happens in politics and court and rational discourse. And then finally, you need a set of institutions to persist it across generations and make sure that it limits the modifications. So one of the values of metaphysics is that it's because we don't know what they are, it's somewhat hard to defend them. On the other hand, it's hard to argue against them. So it's hard to argue against what you don't know. And so this set we've just talked about are the institutions of cultural production. Now, as a reminder, we've covered this in the in personality and morality, in class structures, and in coercive structures, and in institutional structures. There are only three possible organizational methods of human coercion, and so there's the three sets of institutions: the military and state of force and order, the law and trade, which is the reciprocal order, and religion, which is insurance or an ostracization order. We tend to find these as the dominant masculine, the religious feminine, and the family. Military, state, and dominant, legal, trade, and neutral, and feminine and family, orders, methods of organizing people. And again, reminding that we developed, because these institutions are possible, we develop elites that master these means of coercion. And then all human groups develop some hierarchical set of these institutions and elites, whether they're religion, state, or law. And between that strategy, those metaphysics, that mythology, that system of argument, that order of institutions, those elites, the wisdom literature, and all of that persisting, the whole system itself, and our demographics, and combined with our demographic composition, we determine and anchor our futures. Or rather, we evolve and anchor our futures, because it seems like we're totally unaware of what we're doing, or we have been throughout our history. And so this happens by evolutionary or deterministic necessity, not by choice, but really by accident of circumstance, of geography, economy, military, competitors, genetics. All people can, however, once they know what group strategies are and what's available to them, just as we can adopt science and law and finance and technology and reason, we can develop different group strategies. It's just, we're going to find out it's very hard and very expensive. And really, what has European civilization done over the past couple of thousand years? Between the Indo-European expansion, the Greco-Roman expansion, and the post-medieval, or what's called the modern expansion by the seas, we've really paid a very high price to incrementally change ourselves and the rest of mankind closer and closer to the Aristotelian and Greek model.
I want to interject here, because it's like this is like it has not been necessarily a conscious effort. It's just as we have evolved,
we seize the opportunities that are available to us by the means available to us.
That's right. Maybe the statement you made was that it suggested that there's a teleological consciousness aware that is we're at work.
Well, I thought I was following your direction and specifically avoiding that. So maybe I failed.
No, you did pretty good. But it's like this. It's like there is a certain measure of consciousness, but I don't know. It's good enough. The issue is this: it's not necessarily consciously aware of it, and yet still moving in that direction. With an evolutionary, the consciousness is not so necessary. We don't have to be aware of what we are doing, but that is what has been going on.
Oh yeah, I mean, I agree. I'm going to state it again as we seize the opportunities that we discover by the means that are familiar and possible for us. So, you're not going to find, and so some of those opportunities are going to, and conditions are going to drive you towards one of those institutional solutions more so than the others, and you're going to build a framework on top of that foundation. I think that it's a way I look at it, and I know that what you're trying to reinforce, is that these processes are largely deterministic. So we might heroically congratulate ourselves for the wisdom of our ancestors, but apparently it's really just following the intuition, which is really most of what human behavior is caused by. We follow our intuition based on what tools conceptual, emotional, political, institutional tools are familiar to us, and those are the ones that we evolved relatively deterministically. Have I made that current point well enough yet, or are you still feeling?
Like that.
Okay.
That was good.
Given that overview, let's break it down into the dimensions that affect group strategy so that we can walk through and address each one of them. So we have a before state. What exists but causes us to change, to develop a strategy? Our geography, our resources, our competitors, and our demographics. This tends to cause us to be, this is the foundation that it causes us to develop our first foundations or our strategy. When we are developing it, we do it because of the military, our economy, the internal relationships between the military and the common people in particular, which we're going to cover in a moment, and what available methods of organizing elites. We can only use what's available. We may wish we had things, but we don't have them, and we may not be aware that they're even possible. So all of us developed whatever method of organizing elites and each other that was possible at the time. And as a consequence of those processes, we develop institutions, metaphysics, mythology, and methods of argument to be able to, methods of argument and methods of wisdom literature, to persist them. And in doing so, we produce what we haven't talked about. We produce a very interesting set of consequences. One is that we are either closer to the laws of the nature. In other words, our group strategy either brings us closer to the laws of nature, and it does that because we're practicing truth, or truth before face before truth, or facelessness, and this determines how close we get to science, technology, trust, and rule of law within our order. It also determines, our demographics in particular determine whether we're able to produce a power distribution of law. In other words, a very small power at the top that's able to bring law about. Pareto distribution of an economy, which means that just like you need a very small number of people in charge of your court system, you need a larger group of people in charge of your economy, because it's frankly more complex. And then you need a Nash distribution of awards, meaning that basically nobody, no matter how you reorganize your society, the end result will be nobody's necessarily much better off than they are, which is what we think of as the problem of rotation under revolution. So you can succeed or fail at the degree of correspondence with the universe, truthfulness, and the truthfulness you use with each other. The power, Pareto, and Nash equilibrium, which is your ability to produce goods, services, and information in commons in a competitive fashion. And that, as a consequence, determines your rate of continuous evolution. In other words, your innovation, your adaptation, and your growth. And lastly, that determines whether you survive while defeating the Red Queen. We tend to think of human history as very long, but it's more like a tremendously rapid explosion in evolutionary terms, because once we got the ability to speak, it seems to be almost instant. We ate the whole world almost instantly. So those dimensions affect your group strategy, but I want to iterate that while I sort of gave that outline in the first slide, in this one I'm breaking it up into the before, during, after, and consequences, because those consequences are really the reason to understand the difference in our group strategies. So we could produce sufficient innovation, adaptation, and evolution, or we might have the opposite effect, which will produce insufficient adaptation, innovation, and evolution, and will decline. It's not like there's no history of dark ages, and it's not like some human groups haven't devolved. And as we'll see, some civilizations go forward fast, some go forward really slowly, some stagnate, some decline, and some just can't get anywhere. So that's the end of the introduction to the dimensions of group strategy, part 1. In the next section, we'll cover geography and resources. I'm Kurt Doolittle for the Proprietarian Institute of Natural Law. Thanks for following.